So what does far left, especially Marxist philosophy, mean? Of course, lots of things that we said, so I'm just going to give you a thumbnail thing here, but here's a few things. 4 claims of classical socialism, Marxist version. Right? 2 of them are going to be moral claims. If you compare capitalism to socialism, which one is morally superior and which one is morally inferior? Right? So there's the moral agenda. And Marx, as we know, right, thought economics was the mother science, the foundation, right, of everything that is built upon it. Foundational economic claims about the economic productivity of capitalism compared to socialism. And this is worked out by Marx and his colleague Engels primarily and others in the middle part of the 1800s. Right? Communist Manifesto was published in 1848. Right? So hold that date in your mind. So first, the moral claims. Capitalism is exploitative. You have rich people, you have poor people. The rich people have the power. They use their power to keep the poor people down and to extract, right, wealth from them. It's competitive, it's imperialistic, and so the capitalist profit motive brings out the worst in people, and it's a dog-eat-dog struggle, right, and so forth. Socialism, then, is moral because it rejects the impetus of capitalism, the competition, the class society basis. Instead, it's committed to humanity, it's committed to peace, everybody is going to share, and we're going to try to keep people equal. All right, so, moral claim. Capitalism seems to be doing all right and is more productive than feudalism was, right? But ultimately, it's going to be less productive than socialism, the Marxists, right, are claiming, right? Because it's got these internal contradictions that are going to work their way out, and as a result of that, it's not going to be able to keep its act together. The poor get poorer, the rich get richer. This causes internal conflict right within the advanced capitalist societies, and the whole thing then will collapse in revolution. Socialist economies, by contrast, they will be more prosperous because people are going to be working with each other instead of against each other. And at least in the early stages, we're going to have a dictatorship of the proletariat, but the dictatorship will be wise, benevolent leaders who are able to assess the economy as a whole and make proper allocations of resources and distribute things right appropriately. And so we will be much more right productive. So a pair of moral claims and a pair of economic claims. Classical Marxist socialism. Now the other thing I want to add to this is that Marxism labels itself as scientific socialism. Right? So socialism, but we're not just abstract dreamers. We are socialists who think. We have studied the way the world works. The iron laws of economics, right, are going to work out. Human nature, we have the right theory of it. This theory yields definite predictions about the way the world is going to go, and we are going to stand on those predictions. We are scientific about this. Right? This is not utopia. It's reality. So, another death by PowerPoint chart. Right? Let me talk you through it. Marxism is a class analysis, right? So let's take the slogan, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. We all know that one, but we'll tease it out. What does that mean when we actually apply it to a social scientific understanding of the way capitalist society works? Well, we say we have 3 classes. We have the working class, the proletariat. We have a middle class, because there had been a rising middle class, and we have the upper class. The working class, they're weak, they're poor, right? They don't have much status. The middle class, they're comfortable, but they're unstable. And the upper class are the powerful and the rich people. Okay, so that's where they are initially. Initially, what's going on then in capitalist societies is, of course, the poor are being exploited. Right? The wealth is being extracted from them. There's so many of them. Wages are pushed down. Capitalists get to make all of the rules. They control the government so they can extract as much wealth as they want. And so these guys are exploited, and it's very hard for them to get out of their condition, if not, right, impossible. And so they're basically going to, as Marxism predicts, become more and more people in the population. So the prediction then is going to be, as capitalism advances, more and more people will be forced into poverty, right, as a result of the capitalist dynamic. The middle class, right, they're unstable because the logical capitalist competition, right, says there's winners and there's losers, and we're all competing with each other. Some people in the middle class will succeed in clawing their way up to the rich class, but the most of them are going to at some point make a mistake, right, or they're going to be outcompeted and they'll be forced down into the proletariat. So the claim of classical Marxism is that the middle class really has no future. It's going to be squeezed out, right? And that then predicts population should asymptotically approach 0, right, for the future. And the rich, right, start off, they're exploiting and ruthless, they've got all the power, but of course, they're all competing with each other, right? Because if you're a millionaire, you want to be a 100 millionaire, then you want to be a billionaire. And if you're a Marxist, you believe that's zero-sum competition. And so the logic then is to say fewer and fewer rich people will succeed at this ruthless competition, and they will slowly amass all of the wealth in their own hands, and then all of the other former semi-rich people will be forced down, right, the chain of command. So we have three social science predictions that we make. Right? Population of the people in poverty will go up dramatically under capitalism. The middle class will shrink to nothingness, and the rich class, the bourgeoisie, will also shrink, although to a very small number. Now, the problem then is going to be, I'm going to say this is a problem, that even in Marx's lifetime, and certainly in the succeeding generations, right, of Marxists, by the time we get to 1900, right, 1920, right, and so forth, and we march our way through, is that all three of those predictions failed. And it's not just that they failed by a little bit, right, or that the data was mixed, but that all of the data is showing that the exact opposite, right, is coming to pass. If you look at poverty rates under the more capitalistic nations, rather than more people living in poverty, poverty rates are going down. They're going down significantly. That's an opposite. The middle class is supposed to be becoming smaller and smaller. Instead, what is happening is it's getting bigger and significantly bigger. The number of people who are rich is supposed to be getting smaller and smaller, but the problem is the number of rich people is getting more and more. Right? Damn it, there's just more and more millionaires, right? And then billionaires, right, and so forth. Now, this is a problem because if you think of Marxism as social science stands on its predictions as measured against the data. And by every measure, right, Marxist social science failed to fit the data. In fact, the data was the exact opposite. And this caused a crisis, not only by people who are not sympathetic to Marxism say, ha, 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 you Marxists got it all wrong, but a crisis within Marxism. And what you find when you read the Marxists of each succeeding generation is they are aware of the data. We predicted this, but now the data says that. What do we do? And of course, we need to start tweaking the theory, right, in various ways, but this is a problem. And as the generations go on and the predictions get worse and worse, right, the problem gets more and more. Now, I want to say that the crisis reached a head again by the time we get to the 1950s. And the reason for that is important, partly because if you look at the first half of the 20th century, right, the Marxists had said World War I. Right, the Marxist theory of World War I is it's all the capitalist countries getting together and going to war over resources. And what's going to happen is the capitalist countries will basically kill each other off or weaken each other, and that will provide a space for the communist revolution of some sort, right, to fill the vacuum. That didn't happen. But good news, depression, right? The Great Depression happened. Marxist theory says, right, this is the final death throes of capitalism, stock market excesses, capitalists getting greedy, et cetera, capitalism is over, and out of the economic collapse, right, the proletariat will get their act together and we will have revolution. That didn't happen. World War II, well, this is one that's a little bit more complicated because we've got the communist nations fighting the fascist nations, fighting the liberal democratic nations, but the theory was going to be that the fascists and the liberal capitalists would weaken each other, and then communists, if they bided their time and thought strategically, by the time, right, one killed the other, the remaining one would be weakened and we would be able to kill them, and then communist revolution of some sort, right, once again. By the time you get to the 1950s, though, it's clear that's not going to happen. Because what's happening in the 1950s? Well, fascism is gone. But it's probably coming back, unfortunately, right? But it's gone, right? And we do then have the familiar Cold War contours, right, of the Soviet Union versus the left or the liberal democratic nations, right, in the West. But the liberal capitalist nations have recovered from World War I, from the Depression, from World War II, and things are pretty good, right, if you start looking at what's going on. The poor in the 1950s in the capitalist countries, right, they're all buying cars and television sets, right, and the interstate has been built, so they're taking all these trips, right, And international flight is increasingly available to everyone. Everybody's enjoying all of these movies, right? And eating better, and people are getting taller, et cetera, et cetera. So by the time we get to the 1950s, if you are on the very far left and sympathetic to Marxism, it's not looking good, right, in terms of the data. So it gets worse. We've had 100 years of waiting for the revolution. Hasn't happened. Capitalists are doing better and better, it seems. But what about those moral claims? Capitalism is inhumane. Well, of course, there's lots of things we can complain about, how Canadians have treated each other, right, and how Americans have treated each other, human rights issues, right, and so forth. In the grand scheme of things, those are important, but relatively light by historical standards. By and large, you've got a pretty good chance of putting together a pretty good life if you're living in one of those countries. But on the other side, right, two crushing blows happened in 1956. Right? And these were crushing blows to Western Marxists especially, because for a generation, Western Marxists had thought, despite the predictions about the economic modeling, right, and so forth, at least we have the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union is a beacon of our humane, moral future. It's a communist revolution that succeeded. Right? And Stalin, Papa Joe, right, is at the helm with the power to do what is necessary to usher the Soviet Union and therefore eventually the rest of the world in the right direction. An almost messianic, right, fervor about what was going on in the Soviet Union. Right. Any number of fellow travelers go over there, they take the tours, they come back, right, glowing, right, reports. 1956, right, Stalin has died, Khrushchev has consolidated power, and he announces in a speech that all of those stories about genocide, about the asylums, about the torture, about Siberia were true. It wasn't just CIA propaganda. It was all right. Tens of millions, right, of people tortured, starved, exterminated, right, under what was supposed to be the humanest social system that ever existed. How is this possible? 1956 also in Hungary, one of the satellite states, right, now behind the Iron Curtain. Things aren't going very well economically. Students in university classes are chafing at having to take only Communist Party propaganda right in their courses, right? They want a more liberal curriculum. They want to have jobs when they get out. Workers are hungry, right? And so there are protests that are starting, peaceful protests. Well, we know socialist governments care about their people. They care about the workers. They care about the students. The reaction of the Hungarian government was to call up Moscow, say we got big problems here. Moscow sent in the troops, sent in the tanks, and protesters are shot. Right? The ringleaders are dragged off to prison. They are tortured, forced to give up their allies, who are then arrested and tortured, and tanks are sent into the protesters and ride over people. And Western technology, for the first time, this is shown on international television. Everybody sees it. It's not just CIA propaganda again. How is this possible? This is a crisis of faith in the 1950s. So, the old left, that is to say, the Marxist left, is in trouble. What are we going to do? And what do you do if you are a young person in your late 20s and early 30s, strongly committed to your politics, and you're really, really smart? Okay. Well, you re-strategize. And so one of the things that we do know that happened is this is exactly when the new left started. So we have a new left, a new agenda, right, and so forth. And the point is going to be that that agenda, right, is being set by the strategists, and the strategists are the most philosophically minded of them, and we know who those people are going to be. So this is the second thesis. That is to say that by the time you get to the 1950s, what has happened is, yes, Philosophy is at a very skeptical place, epistemologically. But at the same time, people on the far left are going through a crisis about what we are supposed to do, now that our youthful dreams in the classical Marxist ideal have failed. And even all kinds of neo-Marxism have been tried, those have failed. And the practical results in the Soviet Union and other places has tried have failed. We need to do some serious thinking. Now, I've used the word faith. And I want to say that there is exactly a parallel here. Because if we think about the kinds of uses of faith that we're more familiar with, what happens if you're an intelligent young person and you believe a certain religious worldview? Typically, you come to believe that it's true, it explains a lot of things, but it also has a strong normative component. You believe that it is moral and decent, and that it's the hope for humanity that your religious vision come to prevail more. But then you start to grow up, and you start to realize that there are lots of smart people who believe very different things right about religion. You start to have arguments with them, and sometimes they've got really good arguments. And you find yourself questioning, on the basis of the evidence and the data, whether your religious views, right, are true. And sometimes you reach the conclusion that, I don't actually think the arguments for my religion are that good. A lot of holes have been poked in them. They can't be true. And these various alternative religions, including non-religions, the arguments for them are pretty compelling. So we have a crisis, right, of faith that, of course, we know millions of people go through. And to put it in polarized terms, it's, am I going to go with what seems to be the best arguments, the best logic, the best evidence, to go with my reason? Or am I going to go with what I really want to be true, which is to say, this religious view that has formed part of my identity and my understanding of what is beautifully and nobly possible for human beings? And what choice do I make? And when it's that polarized, you really have two choices. One choice is to say, the most important thing is the facts, the truth. And I have to go with the logic, I have to go with the evidence, and that means, as hard as it might be for me emotionally, I have to abandon the religion of my youth. I have to live without that religion, adopt some other more rational religion, or possibly live without religion at all. Because objectivity and reasoning matter. And some people do it down that road. But the other option then is to say, I'm going to believe what I want to believe. There's no way I can give up this beautiful, deep part of my identity. And that means that I have to find some way to get rid of the logic, the evidence, and the commitment to reason. That I'm going to elevate a subjective commitment to something I want to be true over reason. And we do know in the history then of religion that there are many religious strategists who take that route. Limit reason, crucify reason, set aside reason in order to rejuvenate personal faith commitments. Now that exact same psychology carries over to politics. And that's the claim I'm making here about the 1950s socialists. The smart ones recognized that the arguments for socialism had been destroyed. Mises, Hayek, and the others, and all of the empirical data, right, that was out there. There's no way to give a rational explication for the economic superiority of socialism, right, over capitalism. And the data shows that the socialist nations have been brutal in practice. And that by and large, whatever our gripes are about the West, things are pretty good, morally speaking. But if you're a committed socialist, you're at a crisis at this point because you believe that capitalism is evil and socialism is moral. But the logic says the opposite. Do you go with what you want to believe, your socialist ideal, or do you go with the logic? And we do know, again, some people make the different choices. Some people say, okay, I need to modify my socialism, abandon socialism, and move toward some sort of liberal democratic understanding. But a lot of people double down and say, I am going to find a more sophisticated way to bracket reason, bracket the evidence, bracket the idea that on politics, reason, evidence, and logic is fundamental. And that's the postmodern move right there. Another colleague at Duke University, Frederick Jamerson, right, a Marxist theorist, right, at exactly this juncture says, yes, we are aware of Marxism's and neo-Marxism history. We are aware of how things have gone right in the West. And we do know it is evidence versus political commitment. And he's making his point clear. Everything in the last analysis is politics. Your political commitments are fundamental. Everything will be shaped to fit the political commitments.
I'm maybe going to suggest the next year's conference topic, which I think is even more important than free speech. The assaults on free speech on college campuses, the attempts to silence nonconforming speech through administrative fiat, brute force, and sometimes actual violence, is a clear betrayal of what the university should stand for and model for the rest of society, which is rational discourse. But that is not the fundamental problem on campuses today. That is an epiphenomenon of what I think is the more important problem, which is the incessant cultivation of a victim mentality. And while I applaud Kenyon's statement of principles, which seems admirable, as long as the victim ideology reigns dominant, the faculty can pass as many paeans to freedom of expression, and it's not going to matter. Now, let me give you my vision of the reality of a university today. There has never been a more liberal, compassionate, and open-minded environment in human history. Traits that for centuries in Western civilization were the target of stigmatization and imprisonment, and that still can lead to stoning or death in other cultures, are actively celebrated on campuses. It's filled with pacific, well-meaning adults who are the least bigoted people in human history and who only wish the best for all of their students. Far from not caring about diversity, there are few faculty searches where the mandate from the dean is not explicit to interview and ideally hire as many females and underrepresented minorities as possible. In student admissions, so fervently does the administration and the faculty desire the presence of diversity on campus that they employ in selective colleges very large racial preferences. We can argue about whether that's a good thing or bad thing. I think it is not doing the alleged beneficiaries any good. The students are the most privileged individuals in human history at any college. They have unfettered access to the thing that Faust sold his soul for, knowledge. The Renaissance humanists would have killed for access to this college campus or any other. Every book in human history is available to you. You have scientific laboratories open without constraint. You have magnificent library collections. You have the ability, if you want, to learn languages, to learn history. This is the most privileged position that anyone has ever been in. And to test how valuable it is, there are millions of Chinese students at this very moment who are studying nearly 24 hours a day in order to enter this environment. Now, what I'm sketching out, what I see as the university's reality, is obviously not the dominant narrative today. The dominant narrative on college campuses is that to be a female or to be an underrepresented minority is to be the target of incessant and virtually lethal oppression. During the wave of protests that took college campuses in 2015 in the fall, a group of minority students occupied the provost's office at Brown University and asked to be exempt from traditional academic requirements of showing up in class or doing their exams. Why? Because they said they were fighting to survive. They were fighting for their life at Brown. Now, I posit that that's a delusion. Nevertheless, it's a delusion that is generated by an unholy alliance between students and the growing student services diversity bureaucracy. At Berkeley campus, UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, the Division of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, which is funded at $20 million a year, the vice chancellor makes $250,000 a year, which is a pittance compared to UCLA's vice chancellor of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, who makes $365,000 a year, which is much more than most faculty make. They have hung, this Berkeley division has hung banners throughout the campus emphasizing the university's paramount mission, which is to assign places in the highly competitive totem pole of victimhood. And a health services person says, I will be a brave and sympathetic ally. Well, we all know this language of allyhood. To need an ally means that it divides the world up into the oppressed, the oppressors, and their allies. And if you're not in the oppressed or the ally category, you're one of the oppressors. One of the banners shows two underrepresented minority students who say, allow others than yourself to exist. Again, I would say that's a delusion. And the adults on campus, to the extent that they cultivate this mentality, are not doing those students any favors, because they are not seeing that they have at their fingertips opportunities to learn and to plunge into real difference, which is studying something other than yourself, to plunge into the past. They will never have that opportunity again. But this view that universities are places of lethal threat is what leads ineluctably to the sense of entitlement to silence non-conforming speech, whether through administrative fiat or through violence. After the Milo riots in Berkeley on February 1st, a bunch of students wrote op-eds in the Berkeley student newspaper justifying the Antifa tactics that rioted both on Berkeley campus and in the city of Berkeley. And they echoed the very language of these banners. Remember, allow others than yourselves to exist. One student said, I was fighting for the right to exist. Somebody else said, again, I was fighting for my life. As long as that sense is dominant, you are going to continue to get the demands to silence non-conforming speech because it is allegedly a threat to a student's identity. I would hope that for once, a college president, when faced with the demands saying, for any Brown student, I don't care if you are purple or green, to not realize that you are privileged to be there and that everybody is supporting your success, and to say that you're fighting to stay alive. For a president to kowtow before that and not say, get a grip. To be an adult means to brush off, to see the difference between real and trivial problems. I would say that most microaggressions are trivial problems. There's Fordham University in New York came out with a list of microaggressions. One of them was being asked, well, what are you? Now, that's really dumb. It's a crude thing to say. But let's admit that in a world where we are told that ethnic identity and racial identity is the prime, most important component of somebody's worth or identity, the person is simply asking about an ethnic identity. So that is not something that I would say should stand in the way of a student's will to ace the chemistry exam. So we should absolutely argue for free speech, but it's going to be a losing battle as long as the victimology ideology reigns as powerfully as it does on college campuses. And I'll leave it at there. Thank you. There's a current example as well that I would say that shows how extreme the hate speech categories become. There's two faculty members at University of Pennsylvania Law School, Amy Wax, and a law professor at University of San Diego, who wrote an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer calling for a revival of traditional bourgeois values of hard work, deferred gratification, staying away from drugs, waiting until you're married to have kids. They have been the target of endless attacks to prevent them from teaching first-year students. Their deans have, while paying lip service to free speech, have assiduously denounced their views. There was a group of faculty at the University of San Diego who wrote a letter pushing back against their own dean's craven capitulation to the mob, but at Philadelphia, at UPenn Law School, half the faculty have signed a petition against Amy Wax, which is appalling, but the other faculty are silent. They have to start speaking up.
What I want to talk about today is the narrative of oppression that underlies the whole political correctness movement. And this narrative holds certain things to be true to the point that you're not allowed to question them. Questioning them is not even considered to be a legitimate point of view, and if you should be so foolish as to question them, you will not be refuted. You will simply be hounded out of society. And we all know what I'm talking about. If you make some of the claims that I'll be making here today, you will not be met with a careful, sober, scholarly refutation. Instead, you will be hectored and called names, and your motives will be impugned. In a way, it is reminiscent of Marxism in that Marx would often say that an opponent of his was obviously simply a pawn of the bourgeois class. It was not necessary so much to refute this person. What we needed to do was unmask his class background, because then we would know that that colored all of his thinking. This man belongs to the bourgeois class. Well, likewise, it is sufficient to say, well, so-and-so is a white man. Of course he will say these things. Now, if it so happens that it's a white woman saying these things, or a black woman, or a Hispanic man, or whatever, well, those people are not even human from the point of view of the political correctness movement. They cannot conceive of why people would want to participate in their own oppression, which is the only way they can account for why people might disagree with their conclusions. The primary narrative, of course, as Tom DiLorenzo indicated, is that there is an express and oftentimes implicit oppression, a campaign of oppression against all groups other than white men throughout society. And coupled with this narrative of oppression is an expectation that in the absence of this oppression, we would have equality of economic outcomes in terms of job opportunities and incomes. And if this equality of outcome is not present, then there must be a sinister reason. There must be a deliberate attempt to bring about unequal outcomes somewhere. And what follows from this, and this is why the Mises Institute would have a particular interest in this, is that state policies to rectify the imbalances are thereby proposed. We need state policies to overturn this outcome, to reverse this outcome, to minimize these differences, and so on. So it's It's not just that we're dealing with toxic and irrational ideas. These are ideas that obviously lend themselves to government intervention. We need government intervention to reverse all these outcomes that we're told are unnatural and would not occur spontaneously. But the presumption that we would have equal outcomes for all groups is based in an extremely, well, I don't know how to say this here, a childish, juvenile, let's say, an approach to society that is so simplistic as to be juvenile. Because the different racial and ethnic groups in the United States differ in all sorts of ways that are completely benign. They differ in average age, for example. They differ in their geographical distribution across the country. They differ in their educational levels, and they differ in their culture and their cultural values. And they differ in these ways that are so extraordinary that it would be astonishing if there were equal outcomes among groups, even assuming absolutely pure motives on the part of everybody involved. Let's take a quick example to illustrate what I mean. Japanese American women are only 10% of them are married by age 18. But 50% of Mexican American women are married by age 18. That difference alone is going to have a lot to do with educational opportunities, job placement, and so on, because when people get married, it has an impact on these other aspects of their lives. That's just one cultural difference between two groups that right off the bat will, in a totally benign way, account for many of the differences between them. Now, we're told that if there are income differences between groups, this must mean discrimination. And if one group, let's say, earns more than another, then that group is suffering from less discrimination than the other. And then a group above them is suffering from still less discrimination. So the fact, for example, that Jewish people in the United States earn more on average than Hispanics is taken to mean that anti-Semitism must be of lower intensity than anti-Hispanic feeling. That's the explanation for why there are these differences in incomes. Well, then how do we explain the much greater incomes of Jewish people in Hispanic countries? Good question. The answer is the question is not to be posed. If you pose the question, you're obviously a spokesman of the oppressor class and so on and on. So in other words, you can't even make an argument. The making of an argument is an act of hostility. Or, we're sometimes told that black Americans have higher infant mortality rates, presumably because they are deprived of prenatal care. They're deprived of access to prenatal care. But Chinese Americans have even lower infant mortality than whites, even though they have less prenatal care. So there are disparities everywhere in American society and around the world, and there would and will be such disparities as long as human beings roam the earth. And there is no reason to expect otherwise. Let me give you a few examples. In 2012, out of the 100 top-ranked marathon runners, 68 were Kenyans. The National Spelling Bee has had an Indian American as the winner for 7 consecutive years. Despite being greatly outnumbered by black Americans and slightly outnumbered by black Americans in terms of earning bachelor's degrees, Asian Americans received more than twice as many bachelor degrees in engineering as blacks. Moreover, Asians outnumber blacks despite the fact that they are vastly outnumbered by blacks in the general population. They outnumber them at MIT 3-1, 10-1 at Harvey Mudd College, and 40-1 at Caltech. But even this, as Thomas Sowell points out, was not as great as the disparity between Chinese and Malays earning engineering degrees in Malaysia in the 1960s. Students from the Chinese minority in Malaysia, maybe 5% of the population, earned over 100 times as many engineering degrees as students from the Malay majority. And this is in a country where Malays dominate the government and they dominate university policy. So as Sowell says, there are grossly uneven and non-random outcomes from all sorts of purposeful human endeavors. Moreover, serious laws and policies are based on these assumptions that we should expect everything to be equal in defiance of the facts. The Malaysians have never, or I beg your pardon, the Chinese minority in Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Thailand have never operated under an equal playing field, and yet most of those nations' total investments in key industries are held by this Chinese minority. The Chinese minority has had twice the average income of the Malay majority, despite the fact that they've been officially discriminated against. The Italians in Argentina have outperformed native Argentines despite discrimination. The same could be said for Jews, Armenians, East Indians, and more. In the United States, Japanese Americans were so discriminated against that some of them were put into special camps during World War II. And yet, in spite of the temptation to use this as an excuse for poor performance, by 1959, Japanese American households had equaled white households in income, and by 1969, were earning 1/3 more. So there are a lot of disparities, and there are disparities that are the opposite of what you would expect if the narrative of political correctness were true, that discrimination and oppression must have these sorts of outcomes. Sometimes we have exactly the opposite outcomes because human beings are widely variable and they are in many, many different sorts of circumstances. There are many factors that contribute to various outcomes. It is not, in other words, a comic book. The world is not a comic book in which there is one factor at work and in which everything would be equal if we could just get this one factor just right.